Welcome everybody to AE911Truth Webinars. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, and I'm delighted to be here today. We'll be joined in a minute by Andy Steele, my faithful operations coordinator who helps immeasurably with the webinar. We've had a wonderful week at AE911Truth, by the way, preparing for the
Hello.
me, Andy.
All right, how's
you're
my audio?
You're on the air, and you sound great. So everybody, we've had an incredible week. We've been organizing a very exciting September 11th event, series of events in New York for you, and I'm delighted to share with you that the we're going to turn our camera off here. That we have an incredible series of speakers lined up, and no more exciting than Ferdinand Impasamato, the Honorary Supreme Court President of the United States, famed attorney Danny Sheehan, and others. This is a powerful legal set of minds that are being brought together to hear the evidence on the towers that were destroyed, 3 of them on 9/11. Very exciting. Welcome to the show, Andy, and you've got some announcements for us too.
Just as I always do, first of all, sorry folks, we had some technical difficulties, so we apologize for coming on late. But as always, we're going to be taking questions during this segment, and the questions that we take are going to be the ones related to the information that Richard is talking about today. You can submit those questions by typing them into the box beneath the video. Also, YouTube automatically defaults to a low resolution, so to boost your resolution, just click the gear box, select 720 HD resolution, and you'll be able to see the pictures more clearly. So that's all I have. Back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome to week 4, everybody. We are really delighted to present the evidence for the extreme temperatures of at 9/11 found in the World Trade Center towers. And that's what we're focusing on today. 2,500 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. Myself, one of them. I've worked on several of these steel frame fireproof buildings, this one more recently in Nevada with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. But the reason so many architects and engineers, 2,700 now as a result of our efforts at the Philadelphia National Convention of the American Institute of Architects, all calling for a new investigation, 150 of them signed up on the spot. We talked to hundreds of architects and gave out hundreds and hundreds of DVDs, probably 1,000 architects altogether. So last week we looked at week 3 with the explosive destruction of the towers, witnesses of explosions, obvious video evidence of explosions, forensic evidence of explosions. This week we're focusing on the evidence of extreme heat in these pyroclastic-like clouds. Molten steel, iron flowing, iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. I'm told we have a technical difficulty with only a white screen. Oh, that's not fun. Present to everybody. Let's try this. That should help quite a bit. And let me know, Ted, if that solves our problem. So I want to show you, a brief video of how this official story got developed. Andy, you can see the screen now, right?
Yeah, I just got
And let's,
confirmation from our watcher that the screen is back up. So we apologize, folks, but looks like we fixed it. If you can't see the
great.
screen, please send in a notice through the question box and let me know.
Yeah, but it should be good now. Thanks, guys. So how did this official story get developed? Take a quick look at that and then go into this evidence of extreme heat.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melted, the buildings filling, expanding, and flooding. And at 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell, right before us. And where did it come from? Well, that's debatable. Maybe from the guy on the street, the first one to be interviewed. We'll not speculate about that. We will look carefully at the thinking behind whether airplanes and jet fuel can bring down a building as it did. As we look at the evidence we've not seen from NIST, and when we do that, we apply the scientific method. We have a question. How did these towers come down? We perform background research. We make observations. This is the scientific method. We've had it 100 years. It helps us winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. We're objective. So we construct a hypothesis based on that objectivity. It's our best guess. How did they come down? Well, let's examine all the possibilities that make rational sense. I think they came down by fire. No, maybe jet plane impacts. No, maybe something else. Maybe there's explosions. Maybe it's a controlled demolition. All of the hypotheses are laid out and looked at without bias. We test those hypotheses with experiments. Well, if this might be true, then what else would be true? Experiment is the arbitrator of competing hypotheses. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner for all to see. Well, we'll be looking at how NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, fared with respect to reporting transparently. We know, for instance, that they refused to release to the engineering and architecture community their input data for their World Trade Center Building 7 computerized analysis, which they put forth to, quote, prove their theory. So, we said we need this information. We're the people who design these buildings. We're tasked with ensuring the safety of the occupants. And yet they came back and said, well, we can't release this information to you because it might jeopardize public safety. whoa, withholding this valuable information as to how this unprecedented collapse of World Trade Center 7 that we saw 3 weeks ago in week 1 and week 2? No, that doesn't make sense. Well, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a hypothesis that has a better chance of standing up against the data. With respect then to the scientific method, let's apply it. Let's do some background research. Well, we looked in week 1, 2, and 3 at the typical features of controlled demolition. We found that there's a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. We found that there's a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint, usually. We found that that's because demolition waves remove the column supports, the thousands of tons of supporting steel underneath, and that results in a free fall descent through the path of what was the greatest resistance, all that steel. We also found the total dismemberment of the steel structure, ready for loading and shipment. These are typical features of controlled demolition. And this background research is pretty important for us. We found that no other high-rise has come down due to fire. Not one. And yet there's been 100 examples of hot, large, and long-lasting fires. Well, we also have minimal damage to adjacent structures. That's the purpose of a controlled demolition. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. We have enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and hot temperatures in unfolding clouds that are pyroclastic-like. We have squibs or isolated explosive ejections occurring here, there, well apart from the obvious larger explosions, or if we think it's a collapse, the collapsing portion of the building. And we know that there's evidence left behind of cutter charges, which are explosive charges or incendiary charges. That's what we'll be focusing on today, these last two items. This is all, though, direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these features, really, we believe, let alone all 10 of them. Because fire is an organic process that moves through a building in a given area in an office building every 20 minutes or so, moving on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So, say in buildings that have collapsed, like wood frame buildings, you have a organic collapse that's asymmetrical to fall in stages, while portions of the structure that aren't completely burnt are being crushed, and that takes time. So we also have government documentation that's very helpful in finding out whether something is a controlled demolition. Experts agree, hey, that's a controlled demolition. There's foreknowledge. These are planned months in advance. You don't just do a controlled demolition in a day of a high-rise building or any building. And with video documentation, that's all proof of controlled demolition. So we'll be examining, last week we examined the first 8 features in the explosive demolition section. This week we'll be looking at these next 3, starting with pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. Well, we go to the National Fire Protection Association. That's our guide for investigation of fire and explosions. And in it, it says, look for the effects of explosions, blast pressure waves, shrapnel. That's what we looked at last week. But this week, we're looking at thermal effects. And in fact, it says, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, which cause rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. This is from the chemical reactions. Well, we have such before, during, and directly after the final destruction of World Trade Center 1 and 2. And it's easily evident in these pictures, particularly this one on the right and here, where these rapidly expanding plumes of this material that's been ejected already out of the perimeter of the towers. That ejection caused by a force which we looked at last week, which is horizontal, not vertical like in gravity collapses, but cauliflower-shaped plumes like this rapidly expanding cloud, 35 miles an hour, chasing everybody at ground zero, World Trade Center site, and in every direction. Much more heat here than the small fires that we also looked at last week. In fact, Building 2, the South Tower, was virtually burnt out before it came down, before witnesses heard and saw the explosions, the witnesses that we saw last week. And by the way, that's archived on our site. You can just click on it and see weeks 1, 2, and 3 so that you can catch up if you missed them. So this is all evidence that needs to be looked at very, very carefully, and is indicative of the features that the National NFPA 921 encourages to look at. Along that line, in looking for other heat, what do we find in the dust? Not we, but others, including the national, the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey. They find evidence of extreme temperatures in the debris piles, in the dust throughout Lower Manhattan. In the debris pile itself, Bechtel documents temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees. Well, this is a huge problem for the official story, because the official story says that jet fuel started fires, which became normal office fires. Well, normal office fires aren't this hot. They're not half this hot, and they're generally not a quarter this hot. Where do these temperatures come from? Richard Garlock himself, who works with Leslie Robertson, the World Trade Center structural engineer, says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Well, steel doesn't begin to melt until 2,800 degrees. To have it be running, it's much hotter than that. It's about 4 times the temperatures of these fires. NIST claims 1,800 degree temperatures. Even that is half of the temperatures required to have molten steel running. Well, what do the first responders, the demolition contractors, say about all this molten metal? They saw pools of literally molten steel. These guys had never seen this in collapses or in fires. This is the president of the cleanup company, Tully Construction. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot molten beams, says this veteran of disasters. Well, molten material is pouring out of the South Tower just minutes prior to its collapse. When this claims, oh, this must be molten aluminum. Well, molten aluminum looks like aluminum, not bright yellow, white, and orange in daylight. So it's not molten airplane, which is their implication there. Molten metal, still red hot weeks after the event. Weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, says this National Guard person. Molten steel beams, says the sanitation spokesperson. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down broken walls, says this journalist. Metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. dripping molten steel, says the VP at this particular company. Well, you can see the molten metal falling out of the crab claw grip from this excavator. Where does it come from? Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Now, this is Dr. Jonathan Barnett, the author of the FEMA report that we looked at in week 2. He's now saying, after having documented the forensic evidence of hot sulfur corrosion attack, molten iron invading the steel, he's now saying that they were partially evaporated. That's 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. This is extraordinary. And you see it here too, the results documented by Alhazen Astani Azal, who is a structural engineer who had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill where all this steel was taken before it was put on barges, as we saw in week 1. Within 2 weeks following 9/11, the steel was being shipped to China for recycling before the forensic investigators could get their hands on it to examine. Maybe this is why. Because this level of corrosion on steel is unexplained by normal office fires or jet fuel. Jet fuel is just a hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs. It's basically kerosene. But here's the evidence in Appendix C of the FEMA report that came out in 2002. A thorough metallurgical examination. What do they find? Never before observed in building fires. Eutectic reactions causing melting of steel, turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see here from this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid eutectic, primarily iron. Liquid iron, what is that? That's molten iron. That's by definition more than 2,800 degrees. All of this evidence is internally consistent and self-corroborating. It raises all kinds of questions about the official story. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where does the sulfur come from? No clear explanation for the source of the sulfur has been identified. Well, the unclear explanation from NIST is, well, it must have come from the gypsum board, which has calcium sulfate in it. Well, gypsum board has never attacked the steel that it has been designed to protect for almost 100 years. No. That is, it's bonded. It can't come out. It can't release its sulfur content. It never has happened before. The smell of sulfur, says John Field, this demolition worker. Maybe it was the heat from the pile. I can never block out that smell. The smell haunts me. Sulfur, burning. Well, sulfur is added to thermite, which we'll be looking at in a moment. It becomes much more effective at cutting through steel. What else does FEMA document? Well, what they document is identified by the New York Times as the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Yet it's completely ignored by NIST. This presence of sulfur in all of the steel samples that they, the steel samplings that they've done. Not only that, in the police museum today in New York, there's this huge, well, this one's not so huge, but this is molten concrete. I didn't know concrete could even melt. It melts at about 3,200. And here's this piece that flowed like lava, wrapping itself around this handgun, which was in the police. Actually in Building 6, underneath Building 6, the police department there. So what can make concrete melt at 3,000 degrees? We'll be looking. And what about these incredible temperatures that can fuse this material?
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel, and concrete, and all of these things all fused by the heat. And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Well, where is it coming from then? It's not molten iron, because molten steel, because steel doesn't rust. It's not molten aluminum, well, steel rusts, but it's not molten aluminum like NIST claims. So it's because aluminum doesn't rust. So it turns out to be iron. Very interesting. And we'll be looking for more evidence of that too. But what's documented in as temperatures from these NASA airplane infrared sensitive camera flights, taking these, getting fairly accurate temperatures from the surface of the piles. 1,340 degrees at building 7, buildings 1 and 2, 1,100, up to almost 1,400 degrees at the surface. These are temperatures that are associated with the hottest fires, and yet there is no fire on the surface. Remember, we're looking at a thermographic analysis here. This is data. There's no fire on the surface. They've been putting the fires out for a week by this time. This is September 16th. So these temperatures are radiating from the fires that are well below the surface, continuing to burn a week later after they described they've been putting a lake of water in to get these fires out. And yet, even at the surface, they couldn't even work in most parts of these piles because of these extremely hot temperatures that was death to humans. So the temperatures down in the core must be twice that hot in order to radiate that far and maintain those temperatures at the surface. What does NIST say about all of this information? This is John Gross, the lead engineer.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who says so, nobody who's produced it.
You get down low and you see molten steel running down the channel mills, like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Wow. That was Leslie Robertson, the actual World Trade Center structural engineer, who doesn't even realize the implications of what he just said, of what he was seeing. That fires and jet fuel can't produce rivers of steel. So he, like so many others, just went on and supported the official story, not imagining that something far different was happening before his very eyes that I didn't wake up to until 5 years after 9/11, when I saw this evidence that you're seeing today. Well, Thomas Iger, one of the supporters of the official story, says maybe these temperatures are 1,200 degrees. NIST, as I mentioned, claimed 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But steel doesn't even melt until 2,700, 2,800 degrees. what can be responsible for these temperatures? We're looking at a suspect in our thorough, objective review of the possibilities and the evidence, dispassionately, unbiased. That's what we're asking for. It's a real investigation that answers these questions. Hydrocarbons only burn maybe 1400 degrees. NIST has no evidence for claiming 1800 degrees temperatures in the World Trade Center. In fact, steel that they collected based on its proximity to the point of jet plane impacts, they say has no evidence of temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet clearly steel had melted during this event, and so what caused that steel to melt? Well, here's John Gross, whom you heard denying the evidence, actually on the pile, getting ready to cut off the very piece of this partially evaporated beam early on in the investigation, before he became involved in taking over the FEMA report and ejecting that very metallurgical analysis from the final NIST report. Yet here he is. His shadow is all over the evidence. We have chemical evidence of thermite cutter charges or any cutter charges. Well, could thermite have produced that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere now. We have a possible source of the massive heat documented by all these independent agencies. We have a possible source for the sulfur. At least we know what it does and how it works with thermite, which creates the possible source for the molten iron. Iron being the byproduct, molten iron, one of the byproducts of thermite. Fascinating. But is there any evidence of this residue in the actual World Trade Center dust? Well, NIST claims, well, we found no evidence for incendiaries or explosives. Later, they acknowledge in writing that they never even looked for it. It's pretty damning. Others, though, even though NIST refuses to do so, others did, and the independent scientists include Stephen Jones, a physicist, and others. And what he does is looks at a chemical analysis after doing some initial research, part of the scientific method. What would we be looking for? Well, the materialsengineering.com tells us, well, you'd be looking for common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but also unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. Altogether, these elements in the periodic table elements. And So somebody sends him a chunk of this 40-pound piece for analysis. Previously, molten iron formed into this liquid flowing solidified material. So he does analysis on it. He finds that it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. He can also rule out lead acid from lead from the batteries. I mean, there were a lot of batteries on different floors for uninterruptible power supplies for computers. It has abundant manganese, so we can rule out molten structural steel. In other words, it's not that the steel melted. Something else is going on here. Liquid iron with manganese, highly toxic material. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. Manganese and fluorine in abundance. Wow, we're getting somewhere. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. It burns underwater, has its own oxygen source. A possible reason why these fires took so long to put out. They have their own source of oxygen even underwater. Fluorine is used in sol-gel type thermite charges. So these elements, manganese, fluorine, potassium, are often present in the residue and are part of the thermite fingerprint, says Stephen Jones. He sent a second sample from this particular monument, and X-ray fluorescence finds the same thing: iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. And that was a piece of slag hanging from the end of the beam. And in this International Peace Garden in Manitoba, Canada. Office fires don't do this to steel. And guess what? This is not one of the cuts that is made on site by the iron workers. Those look like this. They're very clean, very effective oxyacetylene torches. Compare the difference. This is something else going on here, leaving behind aluminum material on the steel. This does not. So at this piece part here, we also have lots of this aluminum left behind on this very rough cut. Well, with the same chemical signature found here at the International Peace Park, he determines that this is from thermite. Now, thermite is an incendiary, works by heat. You can see it working here. You will hear what you might call an explosion, but which is nothing like high energy explosives, which are normally used in controlled demolitions, but they have a loud bang and very much brighter flashes than what you see here. So let's see if a thermite cutter charge can be developed, a shaped cutter charge, in your own backyard, if you're industrious like John Cole, the civil engineer. Cutting cleanly through, leaving behind razor-sharp edges that he could cut a carrot with quite easily, and is documented in his own 20-minute video on this subject. But there are much cleaner, more professional, patented devices that issue streams of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through structural steel very efficiently, invented well before 9/11. So it is possible. It's just not as common. It's more expensive, and but maybe that's what could be used. I mean, we're looking at the evidence wherever it leads. In fact, there are devices that are made with consolidated thermite as the casing around a thermite device. So if such a device were used on 9/11, all it would leave behind is molten iron, because the consolidated casing leaves molten iron as its byproduct. It's thermite, the consolidated thermite casing. So this is another possibility that needs to be looked at. In obviously a deceptive controlled demolition. We're being asked to believe it's an orange, but it's in fact an apple. So we look at the evidence instead of listening to what we're being told. Now, if sol gels were used, a very special form of thermite, it would leave a unique residue 1,3-diphenylpropane. Interesting, because the EPA analysis finds one molecule that at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Wow. That evidence was not brought out, not researched in the New York Times, nor was the finding of all kinds of fascinating forensic evidence inside this dust, laid like a blanket from river to river across the 3-square-mile area of Lower Manhattan. Lots of analysis was done on this, but interestingly enough, some of it by environmental consulting firms like R.J. Lee, who, along with the U.S. Geological Survey, finds these spherical iron particles, billions of them, in every dust sampling they took. What are they? They're iron. They're not melted steel. They're elemental iron. In fact, 6% of the composition of these samples taken from all different places, but up to 6%, for instance, in the Deutsche Bank building where this particular sample was taken from. Iron spheres. Now, this is pretty important. There's so many of them in all the samples that it was declared a signature component of the dust. In other words, it's not World Trade Center dust unless it has these iron spheres. Well, they're documented by others as well, including Dr. Stephen Jones. And he finds that these are primarily iron, and they have those other components that we mentioned as well. This is incredible evidence. How would they get to be spherical? Well, let's look at a small experiment with thermite and see what it produces. Slowing that down, we see right here in front of our own eyes thousands from this tiny experiment of molten iron droplets, previously molten iron. The surface tension forms a sphere around an aerosolized liquid, like out of a spray bottle. It's aerosolized, and it forms these spheres under pressure. So under great pressure, like the explosive pressures sustained from explosions, like we saw plenty of evidence last week, this would cool this molten iron and form these droplets and fall, as it does here. Could that be what's responsible for toasting the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center towers? What else could be responsible for massive heat toasting these cars? Well, what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? Any other evidence? Overlooked by NIST, but not by this small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, who examined about 7 samples, finally documenting 4 of them, one from this apartment on the right of Jeanette McKinley, who preserved this dust as an artist, providing it to Stephen Jones. And eventually they did a very, very careful, thorough forensic analysis and documentation of these small red-gray chips found in all the World Trade Center dust samples. Altogether, by extrapolation, they estimate 5 to 10 tons of these chips. They're as ubiquitous almost as the small iron, previously molten iron microspheres documented by USGS and RJE. Well, this is pretty fascinating in and of itself. They come up to a magnet, so they have a high iron content. This piece is a 1/16 of an inch long. That's about the biggest one they found. They zoom in and they do an analysis, XEDS, X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, I believe, and they find the ingredients of thermite: iron, aluminum, silica, oxygen, carbon. Well, what is the ingredients of thermite doing in all these curious red chips? So they're not paint. So they zoom in on this red layer and they find nanoparticles of iron oxide and aluminum platelets at the nanoscale. This is 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of human hair. This is built from the atomic scale up. The ingredients of thermite, aluminum, and iron in proportion to become thermite, 3/4 iron. They're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. That is the organic material that they put in TNT or similar and is used for the explosive force. The expansion of the organic material provides the explosive force. So here's an incendiary, thermite, being engineered to be much more explosive. This is quite fascinating. In fact, this has been researched and developed, actually by NIST, interestingly enough, but others as well. And at about 420 degrees centigrade, maybe 800, 900 degrees Celsius, when they put it in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, it ignites, producing much more temperature. So these chips behave the same as the nanothermite studies that have been done before 9/11, 2001, by Los Alamos Lab, Lawrence Livermore Lab, in the studies like you see here at Lawrence Livermore. So that's fascinating. What's more fascinating is that when they do ignite, they produce what? Small iron microspheres, about the same size and same constituency, or similar enough to warrant a real investigation into where these microspheres and these chips came from. Well, this is pretty fascinating because the spheres are actually attached to partially ignited chips, red-gray chips that are, so we know where the spheres came from. It's pretty darn clear just from these photos. So you see, this is it's called superthermite, and this is an internally consistent, again, self-corroborating set of forensic evidence that completely pulls the rug out from underneath the official story by itself, but in combination with all of the other evidence that we've seen in the last 3 weeks in this webinar series. It amounts to something very, very different than what we were told, and we can see why this analysis wasn't done by NIST, because it raises a whole other set of questions, which we'll talk about in our question and answer session following this webinar. You see, this material is designed small because the surface area of nanoparticles becomes astronomical, and so you have a much faster chemical reaction. It becomes much more explosive because of its size and because, as we mentioned, the organic material. So this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan, for instance. This is very, very sophisticated material found only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So yes, we want an investigation of those who make this material, those who help develop it, such as the individuals at NIST who are brought in with expertise themselves individually, like Foreman Williams from SAIC, for instance, who were brought in to take over the investigation. So you have lots of people who could be investigated by agencies that are qualified to force them to come forth and testify by subpoena power. So that's kind of investigation we're looking for. One that looks at all of this evidence, including this 24-page peer-reviewed paper that these active thermitic materials that were discovered in the dust are very well documented in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. This paper has not been contested in peer-reviewed sense. That's how you contest peer-reviewed science papers. You put forth a paper of your own. You don't just wave your hand and say, hey, that's paint, which is all I can do right now. You put forth your own analysis, you document it, and you go through the peer-reviewed process like these scientists did. Well, the question then, of course, is this all direct evidence of explosive destruction, together with the weeks that we've looked at, the evidence last week in the Twin Towers? Can fire create this evidence that we've seen? We don't believe so, certainly. Is there data from the FEMA and NIST reports that supports it? Well, let's look at that. One of the things we want to look at is Fire Engineering Magazine, where Bill Manning, the editor-in-chief, says it's a half-baked farce. The investigation, a half-baked farce. This alone should be reason for a whole new investigation. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. This is the editor-in-chief of the magazine, the Fire Engineering, that is used for fire protection engineers across the country to communicate with each other. Well, let's look at that NIST report, because they did produce a report in 2004, and $20 million was spent. Their effort, their objective is to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. We looked at Building 7 last week. But look at this. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? You spent $20 million and stopped at the initiation of collapse? What about the collapse analysis? Does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the condition of collapse initiation were reached. Why not? Structural engineers do this for a living. Calculate the ability of the intact cold hard steel to resist some collapsing portion above itself. We looked at last week at how fast the building came down. Came down at nearly free fall acceleration, as if this cold hard steel wasn't even there. You have 10,000 pages, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes and building structures and maintenance issues. It's full of ubiquitous, irrelevant detail. 100 pages of fire modeling and life safety issues, Only 1/2 page on the events following collapse initiation. In other words, the actual collapse. What do they say there? Structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb. Came down in essentially free fall. Floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Another huge, massive speculation that completely ignores the strength of the 80,000 tons of structural steel underneath the point of jet plane impacts, through which accelerated at almost free fall acceleration. Didn't even slow down. It got faster and faster. This is not analysis. It's purely speculation on the part of NIST. This is not the kind of investigation the American people deserve. What do they call it? The final report on the collapse? No. This should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse, because that's all it was. When called upon to answer this question, NIST says, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Yeah, total collapse. We saw last week the structure was shattered from top to bottom. One of the NFPA guidelines is to look for the shrapnel, the explosive effect, blast pressure waves hurling structural steel sections laterally, 60 miles an hour, landing 600 feet in every direction. Well, let's look at some experts like Ron Burton, one of the 100 or so structural engineers signed on to the AE911Truth petition at AE911Truth.org. You can look at every one of them. What does he say? Doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable is a huge question. Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents into dust and twisted steel? Well, William Rice, another one of our 100 or so structural engineers, the prevailing theory, he says, would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. Well, David Scott, another structural engineer, signed on to our petition, says near free fall collapse violates the laws of physics. You can remember that one. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer, AE911Truth petition signer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. We looked at that in detail last week. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. It's very clear. And Ed Muniak, another fire protection engineer, says they have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. Full-scale tests in the UK, which we looked at in week 1, involving much higher steel temperatures or computer simulations using finite element analysis violate the theory that NIST has provided. Well, one of the team members himself had something very interesting to say without explaining himself later. But let's listen.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Wow. Well, that's pretty damning. He didn't bother to explain it. When he joined the FEMA team, something else happened. He said, well, fires brought these buildings down. As did Ronald Hamburger, after saying, it appeared to me that charges had placed in the building. But when he learned that no bombs had been detonated, according to the official story, he said he was very surprised. How did he learn this? His investigations never considered his initial hunch. Well, Is the hypothesis corroborated of explosive demolition? Have we shown in the last 2 weeks relative to the Twin Towers the 10 key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features, but evidence of explosives nevertheless? Direct evidence of explosive destruction. Can fire create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them? Is there sufficient data that you've seen highlights of? And we'll give you more opportunities to review more evidence in a moment on your own. Is there testimony of first responders that convinces you? Experts foreknowledge of the destruction. We didn't have time in this web series to elaborate on each one of these. But there are proof so far of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt. If so, we invite you to do something with this information. Of course, first follow up and get more. I'll show you how you can do that. Get more information, get more evidence. If this is your first look at some of this material, you've got some serious investigation to do of your own, and we're going to help you with that. But if you think the official story needs to be reinvestigated, we invite you to sign the petition. We invite you to become a member of AE911Truth. Support us for $2.50 a month, or $5, $10, or $25. Your level that makes sense to your own sense of conscience about what we're about, trying to educate every architect and engineer in this country and around the world, so that we can get a real investigation with teeth. We need your support. We can't do it alone. Donate at AE911Truth.org, right on our website, and volunteer if you're convinced to do something. Support us with your feet on the ground. Andy, we've got some volunteer opportunities, don't we?
We sure do. We always do. If you're moved by this evidence and you have a few hours to give a week to essentially take on some of the tasks that we need done here at AE911Truth, just go up to the top of this webpage, AE911Truth.org, click the What You Can Do tab, and from there just follow the links to volunteer, fill out the form, and we will be in touch with you. And again, it just takes a few hours a week of some simple yet needed and gathering work that we have to get done here, and you can make a big difference.
Right on, and there's a lot of different kinds of things to do, as Andy indicated. So if you don't know what to do, go to our website, click that volunteer form, fill it out, contact us. We've got so much need, and if you're an architect or engineer, the greatest need is to contact your colleagues, encourage them to sign the petition. I'm a co-sponsor of next year's resolution, calling upon the American Institute of Architects and the ASCE also to call for a new investigation of World Trade Center 7. We found that's the cleanest, clearest, less emotional set of evidence to run forward with, because it convinces everyone. Demand a new investigation. Reach out. Contact your elected reps, television, radio, newspaper. Tell everyone you know. Screen the DVDs. Share the resources one-on-one. Resources such as Beyond Misinformation, our 55-page booklet, which is out in PDF format. In fact, you can get it for free on our website, right below, in fact, the screen you may be watching this webinar on. Click on Beyond Misinformation. We'll send it to you. And this is kind of taken the professional world by storm. Those who we've mailed it to, including 20,000 architects and engineers. Because of our members supporting us, that's the only way we can do this. We actually mailed them the hard copy. We got a lot of great feedback. And so it's a very effective tool for professionals, media representatives, elected representatives, We've also completed about 70 to 80 presentations across this country and in Europe of our tour for the film Firefighters, Architects, Engineers. We just got back from the the Southeast, and had a great set of stops in 12 cities there. DVD is on our website and on YouTube. There's a 1-hour free version on YouTube and a 90-minute version on our store, which includes much more detailed information. It includes Eric Lawyer of Firefighters for 911Truth, and the first time he's been captured on film pulling the rug out from underneath NIST by means of the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, which we had a little bit of a look at today, but he goes much more in depth, showing how NIST violated almost every tenet, every guide of its recommendations. This is an extraordinary double presentation, highly recommended. That is the presentation. This is our documentary trailer of the film 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, where we include interviews from 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence in this rather captivating documentary. Let me just give you a taste of it.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fire fueled by its furnishings. It did not collapse from explosive or from fire.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single column collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
Symmetry is the smoking gun.
Has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
This is controlled demolition. Shake it.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA and its C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of the nanofilm.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grape crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can screen this film for your family, friends, colleagues. Take it to work. Show it to those who would be interested. You can see it on YouTube. The 1-hour version is free. Just Google "experts speak out." Comes right up. And you can also purchase the 90-minute version on our store at AE911Truth. Just click on "What can you do?" at the top of the website. Let me get back to the show here. So we want to, at this point, realize that. Can I jump forward? Yeah, let me jump forward, guys. Hold on one second. And we're ready to jump to some questions, and just recall that this is week 4. And so last week we looked at explosive data. This week we looked at extreme heat and this use of the scientific method, which we find essential in the pursuit of truth. And so with that in mind, let's see if we have any questions, Andy. I'm sure we have quite a few developing already.
Yeah, we do have a few questions this week, and I just want to remind everyone we always focus on the questions that are related to what's being talked about in this particular segment. So there's other good questions about the dynamics of the collapse and things like that. I want to invite those people to come to future webinars, and we'll go over that stuff. I'm going to start off with a question of my own. I don't normally do this, but I recently played an interview that someone did with Shyam Sundar, who was one of the lead investigators on the World Trade Center disasters. And when he asked Shyam about the molten metal at Ground Zero, Shyam Sundar said, "Well, maybe that has to do with fires being covered on the site, that the fires were sheltered by the debris, and that this caused it to get hot enough to melt steel." I just want to hear your opinion on that, Richard.
Yeah, well, when we cover fire, we tend to smother it. Fire needs oxygen. In fact, the way to get fire so hot that they can't melt steel is to blow hard, blow very hard, pure oxygen on the flame, which can make it exceed temperatures exceeding 2,800 degrees, so that it can melt steel. We don't have that in dust smothered fires. They don't get hotter in those conditions. They go out. We don't have conditions of a blast furnace. Do you have any other insights on that one, Andy?
Well, my first instinct, of course, I'm not a physicist, but I did talk to one, and my first instinct was that exactly what you said, that the fires would be oxygen starved, and this person, his first inclination was to say that too, is that the fires would be oxygen starved. I seriously doubt myself whether or not, even if the fire was somehow covered and heat it up if it would get hot enough to actually melt the steel and to melt it to this extent that we have seen documented from all the first responders and saw during the event coming out of, I believe it was the South Tower, the molten metal coming out of it that was orange, that I believe was brought up in this presentation. So that's my own thoughts on that question.
Good points.
Now I got a really long question, and it involves a picture, Richard. So I'm going to put it up in the chat box, the link to the picture that this person is referencing. That's for you to see. You can click on that. But the person asks.
Andy, I can also, you can turn on your camera also for future reference and share your screen as well. Either way.
Okay. Well, I sent you the link so you can put that up on the screen if you want to. But this is a steel that was roughly cut. And you said that this was not the product of the steelworkers doing the cleanup after September 11th. My question pertains to a picture that is widely shared in the 911Truth community that depicts a piece of structural steel protruding from the ground that has a 45-degree angle cut, which looks fairly clean, like the one you said would not be produced by thermite. Would the thermite have made the clean cuts at 45-degree angles in order to walk off the steel to aid the demolition? And he gives the web page for reference. So this is, and I believe you've probably seen this picture before, where it's coming out of the ground. It's at a angle cut, and there's been some dispute about what caused that, whether or not it was the workers or something else. So he's asking you to comment on that.
Yeah, and this is the rather famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, photo with a firefighter in front of one of the core columns standing at 9 feet tall, about 3 inches thick steel, box column about 16 inches by 26 inches or so, and it is indeed an angled cut with dripping slag off of it. And most of us in the community of 9/11 researchers believe this to be a thermite cut because of the intense amount of slag coming off of it. Not simply the 45 degrees, although in this particular location it would be extremely unlikely that this column would have been cut on purpose at 45 degrees. And because that is the reason that demolition's cut at 45 degrees, so that the top portion can slide off the bottom portion, and usually with kicker charge get it started, a blast from the side. But we also have evidence of iron workers cutting 45-degree angles with oxyacetylene torches, particularly on those large 7-story tall columns at the lobby, and what they do, what we're told that they do, is they folded them, and they're easy to fold off. If they do cut them at 45, they're easier to kind of take down safely. And so what we've done at AE911Truth is abandon the argument that these 45-degree cuts are evidence of thermite, because there are more that are actual evidence of 45-degree cuts at the site than not. And so it's a kind of a mixed bag, these angled cuts.
Okay, the next question asks, how long did it take for them to finally put out the fires at Ground Zero?
Well, it was months. Some people say 3 months. December, I don't remember the exact date. They actually had a date where they said, okay, the fires are really out now. It's an extraordinary length of time to put out fires, but just imagine the size of the basement. It's like 4, 5, 6 times the size of the buildings themselves, and it's a lot of displacement area or volume for water, which they said they were created like a lake down there. But what could be causing these fires to last so long? Well, as we mentioned thermite does have its own source of oxygen. It does burn underwater. How much thermite was available to burn how long? And the continuing reactions of unignited thermite that were ignited by other non-ignited thermite is ignited by igniting thermite. This is all speculation. We don't know.
Okay, our next question, our last question for today is, has anyone ever confronted John Gross about the picture of him with the Swiss cheese steel?
I haven't, and I don't know if anybody has. We can only imagine, given that the video that you saw of him denying evidence of molten iron and tools of molten steel and evidence of previously molten iron microspheres and molten iron pouring out of the South Tower before its collapse, him sitting on the pile with partially evaporated steel. That video of him denying it has received altogether well over 1 million views. So my hope is that somebody sent it to him. We haven't received any comment from him. I think it would be a good idea. We certainly communicated with NIST. We thought it might be a little bit over the top to send that to him from our work, though we created that video. I'll encourage everyone listening to send that to him, though. How about that?
Well, it's also on page 38 of Beyond Misinformation. It begins the chapter, NIST Evidence of Fire-Induced Failure, and there's a picture of John Gross, the one that Richard showed in the book, or in this presentation, I mean. So if you have a copy of that booklet and you have a chance to talk to Mr. Gross, you can certainly bring that up and see what he has to say. So that is it for the questions for today. I want to thank Richard for showing up and doing this as he does every week, and I want to thank the audience for coming back. And I believe we have the week off from the webinars next week, but we will be back the following week and restarting the cycle. So if you know somebody, particularly in the building trades industry, who you think would be interested in this, please invite them and send them the link to these webinars.
Andy, it was next month that we have off, I believe, and Kelly verified that. So that email was a little confusing, I realize, but it's the last week in July that we're going to be off in order to get back on our schedule of 4 weeks per month.
Oh, okay. So we'll be back next week then.
Yeah, that's what I understand from the back office side. Our wonderful chief operating officer and her wonderful team of web folks doing everything to make this work underneath Andy and I, the people you never see that work so hard, deserve huge credit, and along with our other staff members, of course, Ted Walter, who designed and created this webinar series for us to carry out, and all of our wonderful volunteers, dozens and dozens and dozens, and we invite you to join them, help us get the word out. That's what it's all about, is getting the word out and transforming the denial, the unconscious, the sleep that professionals and public life, elected representatives, media people, it's a huge problem. They're only scratching the surface with the evidence, the scientific evidence that we've been bringing to bear in this 4-week series, which concludes today. As Andy, and so we encourage you to do the rest of the work. What are the implications of the controlled demolition? How do we get a real investigation? How did these people, whoever they are, we don't speculate about who they might be, but how did they get away with this so long? Well, that is coming to an end. We're gaining steam in the 9/11 Truth community, particularly with the exciting September 10th and 11th events that we have coming up in New York. Very exciting. opportunities, as I mentioned, to get together, more than 250 of us, and look at the evidence in detail and package it legally for distribution through the legal system. More announcements on that coming forth, and we'll see you all next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. on the West Coast, on the East Coast, 4 p.m. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.